That's weird. It looks like the music played twice for a moment. I think it was echoing there. I'm hearing myself from your end, Gary. I think that's what it is. I think it was echoing there.
I'm hearing some sort of echo from you.
I think that's what it is.
I'm hearing some sort of echo from you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that fixed it. I hope.
Okay, good.
I apologize to the audience there. It looks like there was a glitch there for a moment. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, I think I'm hearing it again.
Yeah, we're running behind schedule. It's a delayed soundtrack of some sort. Yeah, we're running behind schedule. It's a delayed soundtrack of some sort.
I figured it out. Yeah, YouTube was opened when this was when it was going live. So it had two sounds being fed in. So everything would be heard twice. And I forgot to turn it off, but I got it. Okay, so today we're joined by Gary Greenberg. He is the author of this book here, The Moses Mystery. But he also authored several other books. Books including like The Bible Myth, The African Origins of the Jewish People. That was back in 1998.
That's actually the same book as The Moses Mystery.
Mm-hmm. Is it an earlier version of it, or is it?
It was the paperback title of the original publisher.
And 101 Myths of the Bible, How Ancient Scribes Invented Biblical History. And then The Moses Mystery again, which was published in the Greek language and was later released in Portuguese in the year 2000. His primary academic interests are the intersection between myth and history, ancient chronology, and Old Testament historiography. Mr. Greenberg has lectured frequently on ancient history, mythology, and biblical studies, and he has also presented papers at several academic conferences concerned with Egyptian and/or biblical affairs, including the International Congress of Egyptologists, the International Meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, and several annual conferences of the American Research Center in Egypt. He currently, I'm not sure his introduction is from outdated information on this part here. I think it's saying, yeah, he currently, or he was, the editor of the Besni Explorer, an archaeological newsletter devoted to news of biblical and Near Eastern archaeology, and has written for several Egyptological journals. Excuse me. He was the senior trial attorney for the Criminal Defense Division of the Legal Aid Society in New York City, and he served as president of the Biblical Archaeology Society of New York. He's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, the Egyptian Exploration Society, the American Research Center in Egypt, and the Archaeological Institute of America. Mr. Greenberg has also written on law, politics, and computers, in addition to writing a book on computer software. His work has appeared in the New York Law Journal, The Champion Creative Computing, Personal Computing, Microcomputing, Kilobaud, Torpid, The Abolitionist Outlook, New York Libertarian, and Libertarian Forum. He is a former editor-in-chief of Outlook magazine, a journal of political commentary, and he's also appeared on numerous television and radio shows, including Barry Ferber and Mart Downey, and has served as a guest commentator on Court TV. In 1978, he ran for governor of New York on the Libertarian Party ticket. Okay. All that being said, Gary Greenberg, welcome to History Valley.
Good to be here.
And my first question for this talk is, when do you place the lifetime of Moses in the second millennium BCE? I know you do not necessarily place him in the reign of the same Ramses that the tradition does. You place him earlier. So could you tell the audience about that?
Yeah, first of all, the traditional Ramses II
Hmm.
placement is not based on legitimate evidence. I place the scale from, assuming the biblical story is correct about Moses being 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. I date Moses to 1395 as
Hmm.
his birth, and I place the Exodus in the year 1315 uh, during the reign of Ramses I, which was very short and overlapped the reign of Cephos I. So that Ramses I is basically the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and Cephos I is the successor, and the Pharaoh who died was Horemheb.
Hmm. So that means, after all, that it is true that one of the Ramses was involved, but it wasn't Ramses II, it was Ramses the first, after all.
Right.
Okay.
And I place it in 1315, which is the High Egyptian chronology.
Hmm. And who was the historical Moses during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten?
We don't know specifically in terms of actual biography, but
Hmm.
the evidence suggests that he was a priest in the religious movement started by Pharaoh Akhenaten, which became a large cult for a short while. And based on the biblical story, he had at least some connection to the royal family. Um,
Hmm.
Apparently, as an adopted son, which plays into the story of what the Exodus was about.
Do you I know you talk about the Hyksos quite a bit in the Moses mystery.
About what?
The Hyksos, the
Oh,
shepherds.
yeah. Mhm.
Do you since you talk about Manetho, and Josephus quoting Manetho and against Apion, and that Osarseph, that priest you're talking about, or at least the
You
person
want
that
some more about Manetho?
repeat that, please. I'm sorry.
You want some more about Manetho and who he was?
Yeah, you can talk about it. Sure.
I thought you were asking for that. Manetho was an
Yeah.
Egyptian priest in the 3rd century in Alexandria, Egypt, who wrote a history of his country, which had a huge amount of chronological information. Unfortunately, his original work disappeared, although it appears to have been pretty popular in its time. And we have reconstructions and excerpts put together later by Jewish and Christian writers who were particularly interested in his chronological record because they wanted to see how it fit in with the Bible and what links and connections they can show.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, the reproductions were way out of line in terms of the chronology, but for all practical purposes, for almost 2,000 years, or over 2,000 years, Manetho's chronology was considered the chronology of Egypt. It turns
Hmm.
out, in its present form, not to be, but as I've written elsewhere, he actually had an original, accurate chronology.
Hmm.
It's just not properly preserved.
In the book,
And yeah,
you talk about that you do think that Moses or Osarseph did try to bring the Hyksos back into Egypt. Um, uh,
well, that's not quite. I don't relate
okay,
the story of Moses to the Hyksos particularly.
okay,
They were earlier, an earlier
right.
group. In the some Egyptian accounts, which are almost always ignored by scholars, uh, there were possibly some alliances made with the remnants of the Hyksos, but we don't really know specifically who the Hyksos themselves were. And Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, equated the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt as the Exodus, but that happened a couple of hundred years earlier.
So, you think Manetho in this case was wrong, that Moses wanted the Hyksos, but was it making an alliance of the Hyksos and he wanted them back into Egypt, or do you think he was right?
Manetho didn't say that Moses was a Hyksos or one
Right.
of the Hyksos rulers. The Hyksos were in Egypt from about the 1700s to the 1570s. Moses is a later era. In about 1576, approximately, the Hyksos had been a foreign group of rulers in parts of Egypt, and they were kicked out of Egypt eventually by the founder of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. So that's the Hyksos expulsion. That's not the Exodus, though.
Hmm.
We don't know specifically which group of Canaanite peoples would have been the Hyksos, but it's possibly the Amorites. But we don't really know. It's a mystery. It's one of
So,
the unresolved questions.
so why?
We know they were there, but we just don't know who they were.
What makes some think it could have been the Amorites?
It's a speculation. The Egyptians didn't refer to them really as the Hyksos. They were known as the Amu, Aamu, I think it is. And the name Hyksos basically means chieftains from a foreign territory. I think in Gardner's work, he says chieftains from a foreign hill country, and Amorites could have been in that area. And no one's particularly conceding or saying they were the Amorites. I make a connection to the Amorites based on a certain passage in Genesis, which I use for dating the Exodus.
Hmm. Um, what do you make of Josephus claiming that the Hyksos are connected to the Jewish story? Like he thinks that the Hyksos and against Apion are the forefathers
Right.
of the Jewish people.
Josephus has just basically made a misread or misunderstood Manetho's text. He apparently worked from what was already a distorted version of
Hmm.
Manetho. The chronology is all wrong that he has in there, and he seems to have had more than one edition because he makes references to different places where different names and other definitions are given. He provides two names, two translations for the Hyksos. One is Shepherd Kings, and the others, I think, had reference to prisoners or something, or captive kings or something. But he gave two different definitions. But the Hyksos were Semites. We know that much. One of them was named Jacob L, or Jacob Her, and other Hyksos kings, based on inscriptions, had Semitic type names. So we know they were a Semitic group. But that they weren't the Hebrews. They weren't the Israelites.
So basically,
Joseph found a Semitic group in Egyptian history from Manetho and assumed that the kicking out of this foreign group was the Exodus, but he was just wrong. But his opinion was very influential, and for almost 2,000 years, that was a standard interpretation that the Hyksos may have been the Israelites. We now know the chronology is all wrong.
you also talk about you also compare, or you talk about the comparison, that is, of Moses and Danius.
And who?
Danius.
Danaeus. Yeah,
Danaeus.
okay. Yeah.
Danaeus. Could you talk about that? What's going on between with the stories of Moses and Danius, and is it really comparable, or is it?
Well, there's a bunch of stories that have infants being threatened with
Hmm.
death and floated away and rescued and saved. And I think the Danaeus story is one of those, if I remember right. It's been a while since I looked at it. But there's a story about Danaeus is the subject of a story of a mythic group of stories about Danaeus and Egyptus, who were brothers and who had conquered Egypt, and so that's a legend that's important for understanding some connections between the Greeks from the islands from Crete. Danaeus would have been a Greek story, and the relationship with the Egyptians. And I sort of identify that story in some way with the gods Horus and Seth.
Hmm.
But the Greek story is about a conquest in Egypt and how the brothers ruled and what went on between them and so forth. And they claim that Egyptus was the name of reason the country's called Egypt.
Hmm. Would you connect the account in the Book of Exodus that the Pharaoh in Egypt had Moses' name scribbled out on the monuments with what happened with Akhenaten? And would you say that the historical scenario of them scribbling out Akhenaten's name from removing his name from the monuments is also the reason they removed Moses, the priest of Akhenaten, because they were religiously and politically connected?
We don't have any historical evidence about Moses being eliminated from the monuments.
Right.
Moses is a half name. It's an Egyptian name, but it's usually in the context of someone's a front name attached to Mos or Moses. And the Moses part means is born or something like that. So Thutmose refers to the god Thoth being born.
Hmm.
Ramos refers to the god Ra being born. So Moses would have had another name in front of Moses. It would have been like Ramos or Thutmose or some other Amos. There was
Ah, I see.
but what was the names being removed were by Akhenaten. When Pharaoh Akhenaten became the pharaoh, and I think when he started his reforms in the 5th year of his reign, he began directing that the god Amun, who was the chief god of Thebes, which was the ruling city at the time in the 18th dynasty, that the name Amun and one or two other gods be removed from the monuments. And a large number of inscriptions with Amun's name on it had Amun removed. So that was, and the Amun cult, of course, took that as a great offense and were militantly opposed to Akhenaten. And that becomes part of the story.
You also talk about a character called Cephos, mentioned in Josephus's quotations of Menephu's work, and you say that Cephos was the son of Ramses the First. What led you to that conclusion?
Well, we know that from the historical records,
Okay.
from the list of kings and the names of
Hmm.
kings. Ramses, when Horemheb died, Ramses I became pharaoh. His son was Sethos I, who became his successor and ruled uh, at the partially overlapping co-regents. Ramses I only lasted about a year and a half, 2 years. Um,
Hmm.
then after that, there was another Sethos after that.
Hmm.
The name Sethos is actually an Egyptian god named Seth.
Uh-huh.
Um, and there's a long historical mythical tradition in Egypt about conflict between the god Seth and the god Horus to be king of Egypt. Um, so it's somewhat unusual that a couple of kings would have the name Sethos, or that the Ramses II would commemorate the 400th year of the Hyksos conquest of Avaris with a celebration because of this rivalry and because the Hyksos worshipped Cephos instead of Horus. Everyone else, Horus was the traditional god of Egypt who ruled Egypt. All the kings in Egypt were known as Horus. And Cephos was a rival, and the Hyksos supported Cephos because they thought he might have been similar to their god in Canaan. And so you had Cephos ruling in the Hyksos areas and Horus ruling in the Theban areas. So we know Cephos. So Cephos was both a chief god, one of the part of the creation stories in Egypt, and also a specific couple of pharaohs named Cephos.
You also talk about Amenophis, another character that Josephus quotes from Manetho. Amenophis, you were saying in the book that they were calling him Amenophis, and they kind of didn't really know it was Akhenaten, something like that. You said something like that. And,
okay. There were four. Amenophis is the Greek transliteration of the name Amenhotep.
Yeah.
The Egyptian name is Amenhotep. The Greeks called it Amenophis. And in Manetho, he wrote his book in Greek, his history. So, because the Greeks were ruling Egypt at his time. And so the name Amenophis came to be used generally. But in the 18th dynasty, there were four kings named Amenophis. And Akhenaten is originally Amenophis IV. And so the king lists in Manetho, as they were transferred from his original book into other manuscripts, were very confused over the name Amenophis or Amenhotep. And they didn't. So at one point, Josephus is talking about Amenophis and saying the man didn't exist, even though he's got listings for the name, and he didn't draw any connections between that. And Josephus probably had no idea who Amenophis was or who Akhenaten was, because the Egyptians suppressed the history a great deal because there was a very embarrassing experience, particularly for the Thebans, who controlled much of Egyptian history from that time on.
Why do you think scholars ignore this information?
I think the problem is, I refer to it as the papyrus curtain, sort of. Israel's history says they became a nation in Egypt, and they spent a large amount of time there. The story says they became a large entity in Egypt, and the Egyptians feared them. And then we have an exodus coming out of Egypt. So you would think from that kind of at least alleged history, that there would be a very significant amount of time spent studying Egyptian history and trying to see what connections could be made. But that doesn't get done for a couple of reasons. If Akhenaten is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, as I argue in my book, and he was a monotheistic Pharaoh, it would mean he wasn't the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but he was the influence with Moses that became Israel. If that's true, then Israel isn't unique. And religious thinkers and theologians and scholars and everybody want Israel to be unique and have their originators of monotheism. And almost no biblical scholar knows very much about Egyptian history or speaks Egyptian or studies Egyptian. I mean, they only have a faint connection with it. Only a handful of scholars actually know much about Egypt. And similarly, the Egyptologists don't want to get dragged into religious questions about biblical history. And they want to keep Akhenaten separate. A lot of people love to study Akhenaten. He's very well studied, but they don't want to have to deal with religious questions. So both sides tend to ignore it completely. It's almost considered kookish to raise the issue.
One moment. Christopher Malloy, thank you for the $1 super chat. I appreciate the support. So basically, Amenaphis being Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten, and Ramses I being the father of Cephos, all of those elements, all that evidence is what connects what Manetho is talking about with history, and with Akhenaten being the monotheist, obviously before Moses, and then Moses got involved. All of that connects to it being the inspiration behind monotheistic Judaism, is what you're basically saying.
My theory is, and I'm not original with it, but I think I have the only real historical analysis that deals with mainstream Egyptian studies that proves it. Although other people have written books on it, they're not very historically reliable. But I'm sorry, what was the question again?
So basically, the religion of the Aten, the monotheistic only God, is what basically turns into the Jewish God.
Right. And the reason there's so much trouble finding evidence of an exodus in archaeology and such is because Israel wasn't called Israel at the time. They were Egyptians. We have Italians, Irish, and so on, but they are Americans. And similarly, the followers of Pharaoh Akhenaten were Egyptians. Sometime after they came out of Egypt, based on the conflicts that I describe in the book, they become Israel. Where the name came from, we don't know. We're not really certain what the name means, but it wasn't even the name of the character originally. Jacob was the name of the person who's now later known as Israel. So at some point, the two different stories competing with each other in the Bible about God changing Jacob's name to Israel. So somewhere along the line, there was a name, Israel appeared where it had never appeared before for the Hebrew people. And the first mention of Israel by name appears around the year 1230, 1250, somewhere around there, on an Egyptian stele, which is kind of a monument. And it mentions Israel in a certain context and so on, which is an extremely important historical inscription. And it's the only mention of Israel up until that time. And the name Israel doesn't appear again in the archaeological or historical record for another few hundred years. There's no contemporaneous reference to David, no contemporaneous reference to Solomon. We only know about them by the allegations that they existed, that they had empires, but there is no monuments, no inscriptions, no anything that mention either of these kings by name contemporaneously with the time they existed.
Golem One, thank you for the $5 super chat. Appreciate the support. So basically, my next question is the Aten. Sigmund Freud, in his book, I think it was called Moses and Monotheism, if I remember correctly, he thinks that the Aten becomes the Hebrew word or title Adonai, my Lord or the Lord. Do you also think that to be the case as well?
No, Aten is a very well recognized Egyptian symbol for the
sun disk,
solar disk. And it was adopted by Akhenaten. Adonai is a basic Semitic word meaning my Lord. Adon is Lord. Adonai means my Lord. It doesn't even have a supernatural meaning. It could be applied to a king. It could be applied to the head of a household, perhaps, if it was a wealthy, rich household. So it means my Lord, but it came to be used to talk about God also. But it's not a name of God, really. It's more of a title. God is known as either Yahweh or Elohim. There are two different factions in Israelite history as to what name God should have.
Do you think that the historical Moses had a brother called Aaron, or do you think that's a fictional addition?
There's no way to know. I'm inclined to believe he did.
Okay.
And there's an Aaronite tradition within the Jewish history, obviously. But there's no way to know, absent anything to tell us whether it's true or not, or from which we can draw a conclusion. The only thing I was able to put together is what the real story of the Exodus is, why it came about, how it came about, and what the results were.
Hmm. Um, another question I have, and I know in the book, and I know what you say about them in the book, but uh, the 12 tribes of Israel, you doubt their historicity. You say that
That's
they
correct.
wasn't. Yeah.
The 12 tribes are something of a later invention.
Mhm.
We know, for example, in the book of Judges, there's a story about, I think it's that Dinah, uh, who leads a defensive act against an invasion of against the Israelites, and she lists the names of tribes that she's calling to action and saying who came and who didn't come, and some of them are not the names of the tribes that we have now, and some of them are, and it's not
Hmm.
this. It doesn't include a complete list. There are other tribes that were also affiliated with the 12 tribes as part of the Exodus story, who were sort of part of the Confederation, but weren't Israelites. And then there's also a kind of an odd division. The 12 tribes are also thought of as 13 tribes.
Hmm.
Sometimes, if they are talking about a distribution, Joseph has two tribes. He had two sons, uh, Ephraim and Manasseh, and each of them is a tribe. And Ephraim, I think, was the largest territory in the Israelite Confederation. And when Levi is counted, then Joseph is treated as one tribe. When they talk about Manasseh and Ephraim, they drop Levi because Levi wasn't given a specific territory. Levi was a priestly tribe that had centers in each of the various tribal territories. So when you're talking about distribution, Levi is not really one of the 12 tribes. Manasseh and Ephraim are. When you're talking about the children of Israel, basically then Levi's one of them and Joseph is one, but not his two children. And the stories go back and forth between how they use the names.
Hmm.
But we have the earlier stories, the Song of Deborah. Deborah is the one who led the defense. And the Song of Deborah is considered one of the oldest literary passages in the Bible.
Hmm. So I take it that, given that the 12 tribes are pretty much fictional, and at least the biblical version, if not entirely, And
Well, they may have at some point been a coalition
okay,
consisting of 12 tribes, but it's not the original 12
right.
tribes, son of Jacob. It was a
So not
political
as
group.
described in the Bible.
Right. It was a later
Um,
coalition.
do you think there's any truth to the Old Testament genealogy of Moses being related to the like he had descendants all the way down the line? And do you think that genealogy is accurate? And assuming that Aaron was his brother in history, do you think he was really the founder of the high priest, or is that an invention?
Well, we don't really have much of a genealogy for Moses after. He has some children, but I
Hmm.
don't think we get any generations after that from Moses. We get an Aaronite more because the Aaronites were theoretically the priestly group,
Hmm.
not Moses. And within biblical history, there's a conflict between Mushite priests, which are the Moses group, and the Aaronite priests, which are the Aaron group. And the Aaronites were the more dominant priestly group. Um, so they may have preserved some priestly records, and there would be citations by priests as to their history to justify their being the priestly class. But their political interventions came along under Solomon. He kicks out one priest class and introduces another as the chief priest class. And you get a lot of conflicts over time between who the priests are, or who the legal priests are, or who should be priests, and so forth. Um, but we don't really have a genealogy. Basically, what happens is the story of the Exodus brings a saga to an end, and then we have a gap, and then we resume the story with the book of Judges at a later time, hundreds of years later in theory, and go into the kings Saul, David, Solomon. And but even the books weren't written in chronological order like the history is. It's very likely that the book of Samuel 1 and 2 were the first books of the Bible to have been written. That books like Genesis and Exodus may have come later. These are all scholarly speculations, but I think they're more inclined to see things that way. But uh,
What do you think? What do you think of the identification that some authors make that Jacob, the biblical Jacob, was Jacob, the Hyksos pharaoh?
I don't think any scholar accepts the identification of
Mm.
the Hyksos Jacob as the Jacob of the Bible. And again, Jacob possibly has some overlap in his chronological genealogy with the Hyksos era. But he wasn't a Hyksos. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a ruler in Egypt. Uh, he died there, but he wasn't a ruler. The closest thing to a ruler in the story is Joseph, who is basically the number two guy in Egypt and came up with all the schemes and plans that made the Pharaoh super powerful.
Hmm. Um, According to the book of Exodus, Moses ended up not entering the land of Israel after the golden calf incident happened, and the God character in the story, as a part of the punishment scenario against the Israelites, Moses can't go into land with them. Uh, do you think the historical guy, Osarseph Moses, whoever he was, do you think a different situation, maybe he was killed or something or died before he entered Israel, or do you think he really entered it and the story is wrong?
Well, according to the biblical account, he was 80 years old
Mm,
at the time of the Exodus, and then there was another 40 years before they got to the promised land. So he died, according to the Bible, at the age of 120. It's highly unlikely he lived that long, but we don't really know how long the wandering in the wilderness really was either. Uh,
Hmm.
I mean, there was a settlement. They came out of Egypt. They went somewhere. They started off not in where Israel is today, but on the Jordanian side. Some of the tribes like Reuben and Gad and so on were on, I think it was Gad, are on the Jordanian side. Reuben is the firstborn son of Jacob, and he is also the first territory that Israel would have gone through in the Exodus coming out of Egypt. And I think that's why they call him the first son.
Hmm. Do you think, given what you were saying earlier about Solomon and David, there's not really anything contemporary, no contemporary records of them really. Um, do you think they're historical, they're just not as described in the Bible?
Yeah, somewhat. A lot of scholars are taking the opinion, are of the opinion that there was a King David and a King Solomon, but their empire was nowhere near as big or as powerful or as substantial as it's portrayed in the Bible.
Hmm.
That it was more of a local kingdom that's eventually expanded out.
Final question. Um, did Osarsev's or Moses' people, when they entered Israel, did they intermarry with the Canaanites that were already present there? Since scholars often claim that the Israel was populated by Canaanites at the time that the Exodus supposedly happened. So did their populations kind of blend together, or
I'm
do you?
sure that there must have been a lot of intermarriage. We know, some of the tribes weren't even from Canaan. They
Mm,
originated, there was some evidence that some of the Greek invaders into Canaan became part of the Israelite Confederation, such as the Danai. Uh, the tribe of Dan may have been a Greek tribe that came into Canaan with the Sea Peoples. I don't know if you know about the
mhm.
Sea Peoples,
Yeah, I've heard of them.
but which was a couple of large scale settlements from Crete and the Greek islands into Canaan. And among the Sea Peoples were the Philistines.
Hmm.
And uh, Samson, for example, married a Philistine woman. Uh, so we have stories about intermarriage.
Hmm. Well, thank you for joining me today. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I want to thank the audience and those that super chatted their questions. Their continued support helps me continue my work in interviewing people, such as this guest on this channel. Thanks again. Thanks once again for joining me, Gary. And I would like to have you come back eventually.
I'd love to. Thanks.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream.